Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The JSSJ graduate level certificate program in JEDI empowers professionals with invaluable skills, tools, and resources to connect generations and ensure inclusive growth. Courses this spring include Meet the Moment, Fighting Anti-Semitism and Building a Just World, and Dismantling Racism from the Inside Out. The JEDI plus JSSJ program is built around your busy schedule, driven by your individual professional development, and steeped in a rich culture rooted in justice. Learn more and apply now at usfca.edu/JEDI. Happy Hanukkah! This year, Judaism Unbound is partnering with our friends, the Torah Studio, in an initiative called ApocryFest, Hanukkah Unbound and Uncanonized. We believe that Hanukkah can be a time of year where we connect to many books that were not officially included in the Hebrew Bible, but which nonetheless can be meaningful for Jewish individuals, communities, and the world. Through 4 bonus episodes, we will be exploring some of these books in detail and asking big questions about what canon even means. Liana Wertman, founder of the Torah Studio, which is an accessible and inclusive learning space that encourages people to take ownership of our traditional Jewish texts and to past partner with us on live streaming events exploring books from Esther to Lamentations to Ecclesiastes to Ruth, joins us for all 4 of these bonus conversations. Learn more and sign up for our ApocryFest email list, which will be sent out throughout Hanukkah, by visiting judaismunbound.com/apocrypha. That's APOCRYPHA. This is a special bonus edition of Judaism Unbound, ApocryFest 2024, number 3, The Letter of Aristeas. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofberg.
And I'm Liana Wertman. This is ApocryFest. We are spending Hanukkah, a holiday that is found in a book that is not officially in Jewish canon, studying other texts not found in Jewish canon. Today, in our 3rd episode, we're talking about the letter of Aristeas, and Lex is going to introduce us a little bit about what this letter is.
Yeah, I'm jazzed to keep this apocryphal run of ours going. Hope your Hanukkah is going well. As we release this, we are entering into night number 5, so that's always a key moment in the Hanukkah story. For those of you lighting the classic way that Hillel the Elder did, we are progressing past half the menorah, which is super exciting. For those of you like me who do that and also Shammai's custom, where you start with 8 candles and go down each day, I do both next to each other. We will have our crossing point into fewer than half of the menorah candles. Anyway, it's all very, very exciting. And the letter of Aristeas will add to our excitement as we soak in light during this time of darkness. Letter of Aristeas is, first off, what it's called. It is a letter. It is a letter written by a fella to a different fella. Fellas love to write each other letters. Certainly in Christian biblical sources, they do all sorts of letters. But this is a letter, and there's a few things that many of you will have heard of, even though you might not have heard of this text. Specifically, this is the text that chronicles the famous moment where 72, notice I said 72 and not 70, we'll come back to that, 72 scholars or, Jewish text wizards of some kind are asked to render the classic biblical text into Greek from Hebrew. They do this in the letter of Aristeas, and the way that the story is told later, it's that, wow, all of them did this like individually. They all went to try and translate the Hebrew into Greek, and lo and behold, they landed on the exact same Greek text, all of them, which of course teaches us that the Greek text, the Septuagint, that's what it ends up being called, the Greek translation is like truly, completely an authentic version of the original Hebrew rendered into Greek. Letter of Aristeas doesn't quite go that far, but it does contain the story of these 72 folks being dispatched to interact with empire, basically. The Greeks, and this also takes place in Egypt because they're in like Alexandria, which is an outpost of the broader empire. And they go and they have this unbelievably long banquet where, as a predecessor, before they even start to talk about translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek, they're basically pop quizzed. It's this story of how the king of Egypt, I mean, what in other eras we would call Pharaoh, but here that's not really what he's called. He is like an outpost of the broader Greek Empire. He has this task to translate the Torah into Greek, largely because this library in Alexandria, they just want it to contain all the important wisdom of the world. They're trying to be exhaustive in the world's knowledge. This text, I believe, is actually the first or one of the first texts that references the famous library in Alexandria. And so he quizzes these folks on like every possible moral question and theological question. And he goes down the list of 72 folks, and they all give their answers. And at the end, he's like, wow, you're all super smart. And so now I trust you to render your text into Greek, and it sort of passes the threshold to be in the Library of Alexandria. And so that's basically what happens. It starts with the freeing of a bunch of slaves in Egypt, interestingly enough, in a much different era from the Exoduses. Yeah. There are slaves there again, because basically Jews have been under the control of others. It starts with a very sympathetic read on like, they should, like, why are they enslaved? Like, don't have them be enslaved. And then they're freed, almost matter-of-factly. And that's the prelude into this whole section. But that's a little bit of summary. Liana, what did I miss, and what commentaries do you have?
I think you cover, I mean, it's a long letter and it tells this like very wild story. I think I'm just, even as we're talking about it, shocked at how connected all of these Apocrypha texts really are in the end, and how much these conversations are just one conversation. Because this letter is describing the Israelite relationship with Greek Empire. And I'm pausing there because first thing that reminds me of is the story of Hanukkah. Right? The story of Hanukkah is the opposite.
This is such a Hanukkah story.
It's the opposite, because in the story of Hanukkah, you have this group of people who are like, don't do anything Jewish, don't be Jewish, be under Greek rule. And you have Israelites who are like, I'm going to be Jewish at all costs. And you have this reverse story here where Jews are living as slaves in Egypt, and the Greek version of Egypt frees all of these slaves and is so enlightened that they're like, wow, your stories are so good. Could you translate them into Greek for us? And also, right, this reminds me then of the story we were talking about last ApocryFest, like a whole year ago, the extensions of the Book of Esther, which are in the Greek, right? So we're talking about it's exactly the right translation. And yet you and I have already spoken about the ways in which this translation becomes an extension, an addition to Torah. Mm-hmm. It adds to Torah. And finally, what it is really making me think about is how we as modern Jews think about translation, what it means to access texts in the languages we speak, and turning them into more available texts from ancient languages, and what it means, finally, to be Jewish under someone else's rule, right? Under Greek rule, in a way where it is respected and part of the culture rather than something that has to be destroyed or taken, which I think relates a lot to what we spoke about on our last episode with Joseph and Asenath, being a conversation about, you know, people being able to live together and not one of people having to be totally separate.
I really agree. And honestly, the more I acquaint with these books of the Apocrypha that were clearly well known at various points in time, but were not canonized, however we want to talk about it, the more I think, and I don't like this thought, it seems like they liked interacting with non-Jews or non-Israelites too much. Like that might have been what led them, that might have been part of why they weren't canonized. Now, obviously, Judith is different. We talked about the book of Judith. Judith is like literally a story where Judith, a Judean, goes and takes down an Assyrian general. That's like not about coexistence with our neighbors. And I think there's a lot of threads where when we're overly enthused by the relationships between, I mean, romantic in Joseph and Asenath. Here it's not romantic, but it's just like the general societal interaction between Jews and Egyptians and then the broader Greek society. That's something that brings up a lot of debates. And this text is clear. First off, it's all about a translation, right? Like on some level that we shouldn't miss that. This is like a meditation on the power of translation. That feels like a very postmodern kind of thing. Like, what happens when we translate something from one language to another? What, like, they're engaging in that question here, and they come to a really interesting kind of implicit answer, which is like, the act of translation is no joke. Like you need to subject this entire room of 72 experts to like a whole litany of questions in order to see whether they're the right ones for the project. So clearly it's not just about knowing Hebrew and knowing Greek and being able to like render one into the other. There's this idea that translation is unbelievably important. Like, there's a part of me that thinks like this should be every biblical scholar's favorite book. It's like it's a love story to the act of translation between languages. And it's not an opposition antagonistic. So, like, there are people who for a long time have said, don't translate the Hebrew Bible into other languages. You will never get it right, and you will mislead people about what it says. People should learn the original Hebrew. If they read it in, for us, English, they're going to miss, like, all of those debates are live even now. This text has a very permissive understanding of translation and not only sees it as, like, not bad, but as actively good. And that's really powerful. The last thing I'd say is I went into this knowing about the thing with the scribes and how they wrote this text. I did not know about its Egyptian context that much. I didn't really think much about how it is in Alexandria. It's this beautiful, like, crisscross of vibes that feel very biblical. Like, we're talking about slaves in Egypt. We're talking like it's an ancient kind of story with texts that some of us might be familiar with, like Philo of Alexandria, Josephus, like texts from this, like Second Temple, late antiquity era. And it's kind of blurring together the modes of those. And I find it really interesting on that front.
I want to note that unlike a lot of the other texts that we've read in this series or talked about in this series, I actually don't think that we would ever really count this within a canon of stories of Torah or Midrash, because it's so specifically a letter about us, right? How did we translate Torah? How did we share Torah? How did Torah become something that grew with us? That it does, in my mind, sit in a different place. Like you said, it's kind of like the intro text to a translator's class, where it's like, what does it mean? I want to note how important translations are still, right? When we talk about how do scholars now look back at ancient texts and corroborate, has this been changed? Has this always been this way? We look at the Septuagint and say, great, well, they translated it this way 2,000 years ago into Greek. That must be either like, and that doesn't look like what we have in the Hebrew, or that does look like what we have in the Hebrew, or we can see what they thought the Hebrew meant 2,000 years ago in a way that we have the Targum, which is translating Torah into Aramaic, that the rabbis take super seriously to help them understand what Torah actually has to say. So I'm one, naming how important translation really is to us. And two, you said this actually a few episodes ago when we were talking, I think, about Judith or Joseph, that this isn't a history book, right? This is a little bit different. And I would argue history books are also ripe for us to use to understand the time they're written in, right? A history professor of mine once said, no history book is actually about history. It's about the time they wrote that history book in. And so every time we read something about what those people thought about the past, what we're really learning is what they think about the present. And so when we look at how they relate to translating Torah for a diaspora of people around them, as much as it feels like this old story and they're rooting it in Torah, we really have to ask, what was it like to live under Greek rule as a Jewish person? And I don't know, was it like in the book of Maccabees and was it this oppressive space, or was it actually an opportunity for cross-culture? And like we've been saying, probably the answer is yes. It was a complicated time to be a human being. And maybe if you lived in Egypt, it was a little bit different than living in Jerusalem.
Absolutely. I love, you're kind of getting at how there's a diasporic piece of this. I mean, we don't think of like Egypt, because in the Torah, like, they go from Egypt to Israel. Like, when I think about diaspora, I think about like the whole world, right? But the spaces around what is now Israel, those are diaspora. And the people living as Judeans, as Jews in those places would have had very different kinds of lives. And for those of us who are living in a diasporic way today, I really think there's a lot of value in engaging with other diasporic texts that ask questions about translation. Like, if we as Jews had control or whatever over all our societies, the questions of translation would loom a little less large, because we'd be able to operate in our languages, quote unquote, more effectively within like the broader society. When you're a small minority group and people don't speak your language, that's where the translation questions come in. So like it's very relatable in that sense. The other thing, I love what you said about how history books show you as much or more about when those books are written and not just the time period they're talking about. We learn a lot about how people in the 3rd or 2nd century BCE understood themselves here. And they're talking about an era slightly before them, but they're actually writing about a time not super long ago for them. And they talk about the 72 thing. I mentioned there's 72 and not 70. The reason why that matters, these 72 scholars, is that there are 6 folks chosen from each of the 12 tribes. Why is that weird? These tribes, as far as we know, certainly did not exist in like a meaningful sense in the 3rd century BCE when this is supposed to take place. Like I checked in with my friend, Andrew Tobolowsky, friend of the show, who writes all about the 12 tribes and also the understanding of them in history. And I asked him, like, is there any text later than this that presents the 12 tribes as something happening right now? Like not as something from the past, but as something happening right now. And he racked his brain and he's like, no, I don't think so. Like, I think this is the latest text that treats these 12 tribes as still a thing. Now, what's interesting is even in that section, it doesn't actually say, and the tribe of Reuben sent these 6 people, and the tribe of Simeon sent these 6. It just says the 1st tribe, the 2nd tribe, the 3rd. And so you feel that like they're kind of making this up. They want to have a sense of tribeness still, but they don't really. And that's where what you said about history books is so key. It is fun to me that the number 72 pops up in this deeply Jewish way, because today, a lot of us look at the number 72 and say, oh, that's a multiple of 18, of Chai, of this, and people give donations as multiples of 18, and it's seen as like a Jewish number. There's this roundabout way where, for a different mathematical reason, the fact that it's 6 times 12, not the fact that it's 18 times 4, 72 becomes a Jewish number in this text. And I kind of resent the fact that the Septuagint called it a Septuagint, that's 70. That discards the 2. It like eliminates the connection this book has to the number 72.
It's the Septuagint.
Yeah. Yes. Shkoyach.
Really focus on the 2 part of it.
Exactly. I wish they should have gone with the Greek version of that. But yeah, Sept2 underlined.
To take that even further, though, I want to take a guess at what it means in the 3rd century, in a moment of translation to the Greek people, to focus on these 12 tribes without even naming them, which is a sense of theatrics, right? It's a sense of presentation. There is this moment where the Israelites, who are basically, sorry, I'm just like remembering how wild this is. The king of Egypt is like, I want a new book. Where is the Jewish book that they have? Why can't I read it in my library of everything? And they're like, well, actually, you've enslaved all of them. And he's like, well, never mind. Unenslave them and also bring them to me. And I just think about what it would mean in a moment of like, just for the very first time, going from absolute oppression to having an opportunity to present your culture to someone. And the book that you're presenting to them, you're like, hey, sorry, this is about stories from a while ago. And they are not always super nice about the people who were mean to us, like you. But don't worry about it. You freed us. And also, look, just like in the book, these 12 tribes are on their way to you, and they're coming, and they're almost like making themselves cuter in my mind of like, hey, look, we're just like the book. We're just like the book. You can recognize us. We're doing this nice thing for you. He feels in on it because he's going to read it in a way that I think probably even in the 3rd century, if they were like, well, you know, when someone asks you, what does it mean to be Jewish and why isn't it just exactly the same as Christianity, but without Jesus? And you're like, books, law, stories, and 3,000 years. And they're like, that doesn't mean anything to me. And you're like, let me just tell you some Torah stories because you're going to understand it and we can talk about it. You've read them before. And it's a very interesting way to show us as people now, like, what does it mean to have to act as both citizens and not citizens, as representations of part of your community and outside of your community? What do we show of ourselves to people who don't totally understand us? And then also, what does it mean to give them access to our stories through the language?
Yeah. The book is kind of 3 stages. The first is like prelude, and that's where we have this thing with freeing the slaves. I love what you just said. I think that's so exactly right. I hadn't thought about that at all. That like they're trying to speak the language. They're trying to speak in parsable terms to this king who like doesn't really know what the hell they are. And so like, we still got tribes ish. Like we could make 12 groups and send you some people from each group if that feels like a treat for you because you heard that that's a thing in the original. So here we are. And then the second stage, that is the vast majority of this entire book, is here's our 72 questions. And the king literally goes down the line, and like each chapter in the middle is 10-ish questions. And I want to give a little taste of what the questions are. So I'm turning to a random page. The questions are things like this. This is the one that came up. What is the teaching of wisdom? The king asks. And the person answers, as you wish that no evil should befall you, but to be a partaker of all good things, you should act likewise, the same way towards your subjects and offenders. He's talking to the king, like to your subjects. And you should mildly admonish the noble and good. God draws all men to himself through his benignity, his like generosity, benignness. And then he goes to the next question. How can I be the friend of men? Like all these questions, they're so broad. They're like comic, how broad they are. And you get a sense of what at least the author of this letter thought was like the Jewish answer to this. It's an amazing window into what they thought. And most of their answers, I'm like, I wouldn't say this at all. But they get at these massive, huge questions about God and morality and everything else, that there are books of the Bible like Proverbs that most people spend less time with that do go that direction. But I think that the author of this felt like we needed to fill the gap of like, what's the Jewish take on the world in the 3rd century BCE? Like people seem to be reading all this stuff and they don't know. So I'm going to help them.
Also, and I think this might help wrap us up and move us towards our final conversation, which is just how does Apocrypha work, which is just how cool it is for someone to make a story about right now, like about their time, about something that is really important to them, a legend. Whoever wrote this letter, let it be intense and beautiful and like took something that was not meant to be legendary, was just part of a life and made it legendary. And I'm thinking a lot about what it means to tell our own stories, understanding them as an important part of history rather than like waiting a few hundred years and looking back.
That's a super cool note to end on. Yeah, we are history. We are right now ever unfolding history. I hope that's how we continue to engage with Judaism. Like that, to me, that's sort of the core premise of Reconstructionist Judaism. The idea that in every time, what Judaism is shifts and evolves based on how the people living it live it. Whether or not we and our listeners are all like Reconstructionist with a capital R, I think that premise is beautiful. And this book, The Letter of Aristeas, is a testament to it, that our stories are history unfolding. So we'll close there. We want to express gratitude to all of you who came to our wonderful Havdalah event this past Saturday evening. It was super, super lovely. We also want to wish all of you a happy new year. That's cool that we're entering into the new year. We've got plenty of Jewish New Years, and this I count as one of them. So whatever your practice with resolutions or fireworks or whatever else, we hope you have a lovely new year. And we're going to close out with one more episode that sort of synthesizes what we've been talking about. So we hope that you'll take that in with us in just a couple days. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.